I've had the pleasure of fishing with Tommy several times in his boat, and I can tell you that in terms of being able to manipulate a fly line and a streamer and impart action, there are a few people that know that have the skills that Tommy has. So he has created a fly called the Drunken Disorderly, among other flies, and I have become a real fan of this fly. It does absolutely incredible things. So we asked Tommy to come out and talk to us a little bit about the fly.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to start with a tail here. A couple of nice saddles. I got one in olive, one in yellow here, just to mix it up. Anytime you're tipping a swim fly and you're trying to get to those different hemispheres, really does good to kind of, we talk about off equilibrium in fish, and I'm going to start with a story. It might take a little longer. Help me to stay on track here while I'm tying and talking at the same time. Give them the smolt story. I used to guide steelhead a lot in the springtime, which I don't anymore because it's just ugly and it's snagging and naughty and whatever you want to call it. But there's some things that I saw when I had all that extra time on my hands, when I had just folks out of the boat, and we have these big smolt balls, which is to say the 2-year-old steelhead. They come down in, anywhere from pods of, like, I'd say 15 to 50, and they're all about, say, 8 to 12 inches. We have all this natural, all of our fish are wild on the Pere Marquette. We don't get the brown trout or steelhead plants. And as a result, you can see these big balls of fish exiting the river around the first, second week of April. You'll start to see it. And these smolt balls will come over these shallows, and you would see this group of like 50 small trout coming up onto these shallows, and one of them would break off and just start cruising towards like the other bank as fast as it could. In its exodus, you would see that fish kind of flashing like a rapella, if you think about it. The flashing is basically the fish's belly with an off equilibrium of air, or the swim bladder, or maybe it got bumped on the head, who knows. But as soon as the fish is trying to keep its belly under them, the trout notice that. It's like seeing that like injured deer in the herd, or the lion hunting, the antelope, and it sees that one that's off, and it picks that one. It wants to break it out of the herd so it can have its way with it. And that's exactly what happens when these smolt you would never see the brown trout until the very end. The fish would get close to the shallows, and this big just butterball would come up and just end it with this, like somebody throwing a shoe in the water. And there would be no more smolt. And these brown trout had gotten it down to a rough science, having these steelhead over the years and years. And, some of these brown trout are old enough to drive cars and vote, for that matter. And they get a pretty good routine down. And in that routine, we've tied a lot of these flies in the idea that if you can show that off equilibrium, that rapella kind of tipping yaw, that little shit, I'm in trouble, I'm trying to keep myself square, but that was a big bite trigger for us for a very, very long time. So you guys can see I just put in that tail, kind of marry it. You can kind of see it's very, I'm trying to make that butter knifey, so I want those cuffed together. Any flash will do. I mean, if you can ever come across the Cascade crinkle flash, this stuff is like kryptonite. I won't lie. Head run works really good. Dano's got all of this stuff up at his shop at 1884, by the way. He's fully invested with fishing this witchcraft, so.
I don't think I've seen
Yeah,
that.
hold on.
We're gonna have
Yeah,
to
no,
go.
it's a blend. It's not just one, and it's a really heavy duty flash. I'd say there's one drawback. Anytime you get into the crinkle flashes, as you get them wet and dry a few times, it's not like Flashaboo that as long as you don't dent it, it'll be fine. This stuff has a tendency to dry out after a while, but usually the wire in the middle of the fly will give out before you've got to sweat that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So once the wire goes out in the middle, and we cut this, guys, maybe 2/3 the way down that. We don't want to cover the whole thing. See that nice dark back there? That's just going to be our tail. And then I'm going to get in here with some, you can kind of see the best way to use your polar chenille. And I can't stress this enough. Polar chenille is, I mean, really the easiest way to build body without building mass. And if you're going to get into swim flies, you should understand that silhouette is far better than mass. When I used to tie a lot of the stuff when I got back from Alaska, it had a lot of mass and it was tough to pull out of the water, fucking stuff on the shoulders for that matter. And as I got into these swim flies and saw that the fly could go 4 ways to that one that I was giving it, it really was not hard for me to kind of go all in on this. And really, the biggest inspiration behind this would be probably the Dahlberg Diver, the Muddler Minnow, maybe a little Gallup Cougaree mixed in there. Um, there's a lot of influences here, but I got to tell you, my main influence would certainly be a Rapella. And the reason being is this, is we always talk about change and flyer. This one worked that day, and that one didn't work another day. You talk to a Rapella fisherman who's been fishing a black and gold number 13 for 25 years. Guess what he's using tomorrow? Black and gold number 13. And he catches fish every time he goes out. And he's not doing anything super special, but that bait in conventional action is doing all that work for him. Whereas in fly fishing, we have to make that action. So we either choose to kind of do the easy out, which is to say depth equals lead. And I would argue if you're using a sink tip, why are you adding more lead to the fly at that point? I mean, you've got 300 grains of it. Why don't you use that instead of a barbell? And in doing so, the difference between fishing leaded flies and swim flies is the line fishes a swim fly. With leaded flies, it's more direct. So you're actually jigging directly to the fly, the weight of it, to lift it up so that it can have that falling retreat. Whereas this bug, we're trying to put shock into the line that transmits to the head of that wedge to provoke an action of 4 ways to the one. If that makes any sense.
I think this is a critical point, Tommy, that took me a little bit to understand the difference between a swim fly and a lead-headed fly, and the fact that you're fishing the line and not direct to the fly. And I think that's a critical point that I think is worth restating.
We get into all the different lines for different reasons and this and that, and we choose these different sink tips based upon the watersheds and the depth we need to fish. And then again, maybe even the size of fly we're trying to transmit those actions and shocks to, which is why we don't use rod. In most case in point, we're using to shock the line with a straight strip. We have used a lift wiggle where we'll use the lifting of that wedge against the immediate anchor of the cast, and that can play a nice shallow, but it's very awkward. Obviously, there's this two-handed plays for a lot of that middle size river to tailwater game, which is crucial if there's any kind of clarity. And then obviously the down swat, which is really the backbone. That is probably the one technique in these deliveries among the 5 variations that is probably delivered in every cast, because we start with that initial depth grabs of 1 or 2 feet with that swat of the thumb, where we swat that line down to amplify that shock delivered to the wedge so it would dig in hard, but then swim out or swim up. And that recovery, that swat, is then kind of relaxed. In that intermission, you give some slack to allow the sink tip, and here's Maro, it's funny you break. So these sink tips, everybody's buying them and fewer are using them. And there is really a difference. If you go out there and throw a sink tip to the bank and simply strip it in, one could argue you're fishing it more like an intermediate than a sink. A sinking line is only sank if you allow for slack upon its impact. It has to be split shot. It has to be allowed to achieve some depth before you would then strip and then bring that fly down to its achievement. So with lead, you don't really need to play that game, because the lead is already its own depth and it will enhance whatever depth that you're trying to get. I'm not big on depth. I think depth is overrated. Plus, you can't see them eat it if it's too deep. So I don't believe in the idea that these fish are moving 2 yards to come get your fly, that your necessity to hit the bottom is necessarily warranted. I don't buy that. So the idea that with my 250 or 300 grain sink tip that I need to then again add lead to the fly, I'm not. That's something I did when I was a teenager. I've outgrown that. So I like watching swim flies.
So the rabbit strip, the leather piece on the rabbit is very thin.
Very. On the groovy strips, you can buy them or could buy them in a micro groovy. And whenever I'm doing these like small ones, this is a micro. I tie one smaller, that's a nano. having that very small bunny, can you see that collaring effect there? I don't know if it's showing up on the, is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
when I think, I
So-
mean, like, do you ever worry about the thickness of like the thickness of the leather on the Zonker strip? You know what I mean by that?
Yeah, so I actually used to use the some of the dubbing loops and stuff like this to add in my bunny. The problem is that the speed at which we're casting these flies and then the impacts to the water, the dubbing loop material would last a fraction of the time. It would just simply, as you use the fly more, as you know, no matter how much you tighten down, the thread wants to let up a little bit when it's wet. And in that wetness and a dubbing loop and slamming it enough, I just lost too much material. And the groovy strip here, I don't know if you can see this, but I mean, there is not a lot of,
Yeah, it
I
looks very
mean,
thin. Looks very, very
no,
thin.
it's very, no, this stuff's gold. I mean,
Yeah.
and I've got like piles of it because I bought it up the last, I don't know, 7 years. Again, it'll be back. And if you want to, call Montana Fly right now and just say, we're looking forward to the groovy strips, Tommy said. And that should help. That should help get stuff. But yeah, it gives a really nice ability to see. You can see like there's a yellow in there, like a brown orange, and then a cream with all grizzly in there. But that gives a really nice effect. Oh, thank you, Dano. Yeah. So we're gonna go in here with our first flank. Sorry for talking and tying and teaching
Hey,
all at the same. So you guys
Tom,
keep me in the
Tommy,
straight and narrow here. Go ahead.
can I ask you a question about the polar chenille on the different sizes? Are you clipping that at all to shorten
Negative.
the length? No, you just keep
Negative.
it.
By the time the smoke clears, it all lays back anyways. The nice thing about the polar chenille is that it only really opens when it relaxes. The rest of the time, it would be like a fur. It kind of flattens. And again, there's so little to it. As soon as I start getting into the dubbing loops or doing blends with dubbing loops, then
Yeah.
I get into a mass. There's like a heavy amount of drag in that pinch. You know what I mean? I don't want mass here. I'm not looking for bulk. I'm trying to build a paper airplane for underwater. Does this make sense? I don't
Sure.
want
Yeah.
any, you can see this is why we're down to feathers. And I don't know if you've ever picked one of these things up, but everybody that picks one up and sees the size of them the first time go, damn, that's really light. Because you know why? There's no lead.
Exactly.
I mean, the whole profile of this, the heaviest, most bulky part of this is that 2 wrap of micro bunny. The rest of this is plastic and chicken. So there's not a whole lot of just gonna pop that off. You should use your scissors there. That's naughty. Gonna give that really tight. You really want to make sure that's really nice. But now if you can kind of see here, we're kind of keeping all of the colors of brown trout in mind whenever we're tying this. Big fan of putting a spin on my thread. Just keeps it from splicing when I'm going for those last ones and really lets me rock in my my whip finishes. And I'll take my little whip finish there and I'll give that a little extra grab there to bite that GSB. Whenever you're tying this fly or any really hardcore streamer, I do recommend the GSB. And when you're cinching down your materials, take the time to give it good snugs because GSB, you can do that. And it locks that stuff down and it fights that opening that we were talking about when things are kind of turning that way. Okay. So here's kind of
What
the
size GSP are you going for?
which one's this one? This is that Semperfi Nano 100 denier.
100?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And I don't mind the 75 too for doing the really small stuff. It's optional. But the 100 keeps you down to kind of limited. But you can kind of see how we're starting to build the paper. You got the butter knife. Is that where is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
If I turn it this way, you can kind of see I mean, it's just a butter knife, but it's a nice rudder.
So
Then
maybe talk a little bit about the purpose for the mallard flank over the back and how that gives you that wiggle.
well, if you guys have ever made a paper airplane, right? And you always see that like the back is there and then you've got the underside rudder, right? I'm not doing anything different here. I'm building something that would dart and then swim out. I'm not looking for something that I pull and then falls. That's just boring and leechy and it's hard to even call it sculpiny. Nothing falls except for a leech or an earthworm. You know what I mean? Maybe a crawdad in really bad shape. I like stuff that's fishing kind of laterally or neutrally in the current, but I don't like to forget about a bug and assume that it's going to hit the bottom within 3 seconds of forgetting about it. I think it's hard to play those kills and deaths and those injuries if your bug is falling for the bottom. So it's not really neutral or kind of recovering with some float, it's just falling again. And that's hard to kind of make a bug do anything beyond fall once you've added that lead. There is a catch to using lead. You forfeit a lot of movement as soon as you say, I'm going to fish it. And it's not to say that you can't put a whole new train of different materials behind lead, but the story is still the same. It goes up, then it goes down. We're not talking about this. I could be honest with you. I can even down swat this, but based upon the current that this particular bug is in, at any given moment, this bug's going to go a completely different way than I might think it is because it has that option, because that wedge is going to dig in and that current's going to float that we don't know, maybe down. It's kind of unique like that. And I think that that inconsistency adds even more to the idea of it being an injured something. The more something is injured or just dying, the more you're winning if you're trying to sell this, as a real thing. It is about making this thing look not just there, but injured or dead. So, and just dead is the best one. It's like I said, it's like the fresh Big Mac without having to go all the way up to the drive-through. So, I've got here 30-pound bite wire. You can get into the nice bite wire from Rio, or you can stay with some of the more basic AFC stuff. I've put on a bead here in the middle, and this is to build a teardrop, which I'm going to continue. Obviously, I'm going to bring that way up here. And I only want a little bit of train behind this. See how I'm not really losing much there. I'm just putting enough there that I can have that teardrop so that there's plenty of play in that rear hook when it wants it. And then I'm going to come down my side of the hook first, tying that wire in. Every once in a while, I'll give that a pretty substantial snug. And then I'm going to take both of these wires, kind of cup them around to kind of build a nest for the would-be rattle. As this kind of cups down in here, I'm going to build a little nest here for this. And I'll show you as soon as I'm done. And you can kind of see these little nests that work out just perfectly for these little rattles that we're going to put in. And most people think I'm using the rattle for something I'm really not. I mean, is there the sound of a click sometimes when I'm doing that straight pop or a down swat? Sure. Do I think that fish is drawn in from yards away because I have this little glass bead? No, I don't think that. But what I'm trying to do is build profile, because as we all know, in building a fish pattern, the fish tends to be thickest and bulkiest and near its front. So all I need to do is leave a signature in the water. Something I've always had a problem with some of the older Bufords was they build the big massive head that left the signature in the water, and then they leave all this extra mass back here and say they need that mass to mimic real fish. And I'm like, well, if the forward part is the biggest and this is thinner, isn't this all in the cavitation of that would-be forward push? So the idea of fishing mass versus just leaving the signature for those fish to find on their lateral line, I think is a big misconception. I would take less material behind the big heads for added movement behind the head versus building some mass amount of material that would otherwise drag or anchor it in the current. Does this make sense?
Yeah, basically what you're saying is that it's the water push that they're feeling, not so much the weight of the fly.
Correct. As soon as the signature of the thickest or largest part of that fish is moved through the water column, whatever signature could be felt by that fish's lateral line is not left in the rear of that bait fish or pattern. It's in the forward. And that's why when you build these patterns, having a nice signature up here is great, but then leave all this with limited materials here for maximum movement post pause, fall, whatever style of fly you're using at that point.
Right.
So, and because we're adding 3 points of flash here and on a smaller fly, we tend to limit this flash. We don't get crazy with it. We're just using enough to, again, I think when I was a kid, I always wondered what the magic of the Rapella was. And I thought it was always just what I called the inconsistent random flash, which, ironically matched exactly what I saw in those smolt and fry that would die all spring long on the Pere Marquette as a result of all the predators. We have an early predator population of trout. They start really young here on the PM. As a result of all the salmon and steelhead in the system, not only do the fish have this bulk mass of insects and crustacea that they can forage on like any other river system. But then they get this influx of migratories that just packs the system with eggs and fry and smolt and par. And that's year round. These fish are subject to that huge mass of protein. And as a result, they start chasing smaller fish earlier than they would be on, say, like a tailwater, where the baseline of good fishing is bugs, because those tailwater fish eat bugs like it's going out of style and don't have little salmon and steelhead swimming all over their noses all day long. So there's a reason the streamer fishing has a really great test tube for application here in Western Michigan, or really anywhere migratories would enter. So, and I love these questions. These are good questions. Can I turn that again? So right here we've got our little teardrop here for maximum movement. We've got the bead here for a nice flare separation on the flash. And then right here, we're going to add in one more bridge of this way cool, groovy, awesome. Again, you don't always have to use the groovy. Like whenever I'm using like for chartreuse or some like pike or simpler flies, even some of the fire tiger patterns, I stay away from it. But for these patterns that you're trying to build a pattern that kind of mimics that of a spotted fish, I think anytime you can add more color and grizzly to the happening, the more likely you're going to mimic some type of spotting. On some of those Beetlejuices, as you can see, I put it in some of those guinea fowl to kind of mimic some smaller brook trout and whatnot. And even some of my smaller drunks that I've used up north around brown trout water that have brook trout, I'll add in that guinea instead of the mallard, just to make it so that I'm kind of getting that full spot. There's the end of that one.
All right, and when you're pulling the bunny forward, you're not palmering, right? You're going like one over the other.
So on this one here versus the rear one, where I do one and then one in front and then half of one tie down, this one I'll do both one and then one on top of that and then one under locked down, so that I can have that mass back here and save room for the rattle. And again, I'm trying to get just bigger moving forward. So this is the same amount of wraps as this spot back here, but I've condensed it, which again makes it one step bigger than the rear.
Right.
Does that make sense? So I'm not adding more material so much as I'm adding more material, or I'm adding the material in a smarter way to kind of give it that. You can kind of see just looking at it, this is a little bit more broader than the rear now. And then coming in back here, we're going to grab that kind of marriage of polar. And this one here happens to be the copper and the gold, or I think it's called the copper gold or copper UV. I think it's copper UV. That's what it is. And then the other one is that yellow UV. And if you mix them together, they have a tremendous, and what, green and yellow mixed together for brown trout for some reason underwater with these tans and coppers mixed in, just really sets off the idea of what a brown trout may or may not be here. But yeah, we don't really lose these. I got a box of those, as you can see. So we don't like to leave a man behind, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I've been on the boat and hung one in a tree, and let's just say Tommy will put in some effort to retrieve that fly.
I'll get it. The way to think about it is like this. Would you rather spend another 25 minutes to a half an hour retying it, and then again having to pull the boat over, retie the fly on? And here's the other part of that, the picking of the fly out. I think it's hilarious how everybody says, oh, I'm just going to reach in the box and grab a fly. When has that ever happened? Jesus, anchor goes down, a couple of beers get pulled out. The guys start looking at each other about, okay, well, is it going to be this one? 25 minutes later, you guys pick the fly. And so the idea that time lost doing what we're doing, I don't think it's not really the case there. We're not really losing time at all by getting the flies back. In fact, we're saving time. And efficiency is a big part of streamer fishing. I mean, if you spend half the day with no confidence in a fly, and this is something that Morrow is going to tell you too, there's nothing I can tie on that's going to give you an immediate confidence. If you stop fishing the fly as if it's being watched, you start seeing fewer fish, if at all any fish. The idea that the fly needs to be changed every 5 to 10 minutes if it's not working is absurd, because that would leave you changing the fly all the time in streamer fishing and fishing far less time. The bugs work better in the water. If I change my fly with a streamer in a given day, it's 2 or 3 times, and that's simply out of boredom or maybe light. Sometimes the sun and the clouds come out. I can play that game. But the idea that there's some magical starburst color that the fish wants that you're not showing him, I mean, explain how chartreuse works so well. I mean, if we're trying to match the hatch on streamers and chartreuse works as good as it does, it's hard for me to build that bridge of matching the exact hatch. I build this brown trout because it's a confidence thing. I know a brown trout is more likely to want to fend off and feed on a smaller fish if it is like its own, and if I'm in that type of water. However, if I'm fishing the Pure Marquette that's littered with smolt, I might throw a little rainbow version of the same thing. Does this make sense?
I think your comment around the black and gold Rapala is what kind of drove that point home for me, which is those guys never change color and they're catching way more fish than anyone else, right? So
They do. And they're not changing patterns. And the
Yeah.
idea that you need to change your pattern all the time because you think that it's more about the individual fish. And I'll tell you this right now, and Dan right next to me will back me up. That man right there is a great freaking angler. And every time he goes fishing with his buddy, he's out fishing him 3-1. Every time he goes fishing with me, I'm 4-1. So just remember that as you get better at the presentation and that confidence and faith that you're being watched, and here's the proof of it. You ever see the guy, he finally sees the fish coming, right? He's like a zombie before this moment, but all of a sudden the fish is right up under his rod. He's out of strips and line, and he's sitting there kind of tapping his rod around left and right and doing all these creepy stuff, and everybody's oohing and on. And my question is why didn't we start from there? This idea that you have to see a fish to move the fly in a certain way to tease him into that final predation, what you should be thinking of is the moment the bug hits the water, you're selling that thing as if it's like you have to start selling this fly out of the gate. If you don't, the fish will take notice, especially with as many people streamer fishing. As I understand it, there are some people here that fish the Grand. Is that correct?
yeah, many. Yep.
There's many. You guys know Snakey's up in there. We used to bounce around in there when I was in my teens and early 20s. And all the nymph guys would be in there going, you're never going to catch snot with that big stuff. And my argument is how many people threw the big stuff to know that? And the answer was pretty simple. Nobody. Everybody threw what works, which is nymphs. Nymphs always work. So do streamers, especially if you work them correctly each time. Streamers do work that well. You just have to sell them better. And yeah, I think everybody just wants to throw on a woolly bugger and say, oh, they're not biting on streamers. It's not how this works. You're trying to pick a fight. You're not trying to window shop for them. You got to get in there and you got to make them notice you. You have to get some amount of offense, and you want to get that fish coming out of the corner swinging like Tyson. Because if you leave it up to them to just kind of come up and critique you, don't mistake that fish that comes up behind the bug really fast as a miss or a consideration, so much as just a elongated refusal. That's just a refusal. If the fish wants it, he can get it. He really can. So the idea that he's chasing you and he doesn't like your pattern, I would argue change your presentation, not the color or the pattern. So we were talking about that general larging as a bait fish. So again, the rattle, people say, oh, do you think they can really hear a lot of that rattle? I said, no, not at 2 yards away. No, I really don't. I think it's still the profile, the bug, the movement. That's what draws the fish in from distance. What I'm trying to do is make sure that my fish continually is getting bigger. So back here, I didn't have a rattle when I gave it those few wraps of the same polar, but here I did. And now as a result, I have more mats. When I cut this off and add the flanks, this is a fish that is getting larger as it gets to its head and then tapers off just like the nose of a fish. So yeah, it's pretty ugly right now. Give me 1 second here. Hold on. It's like a bad hair day here. Hold on. There's
Is that
one.
a hairline product, the Rattle?
Yeah, you can buy them. Really, all the companies are doing them now. It's just like I think this one's like the 7mm or the 5mm 2 bead. Some of the bass guys use some gigantic stuff, which I don't really have any use for. I have a few buddies of mine that tie these big triples, these big ones on like 5 and 6/0 for muskies, and those guys are using those full dropout, double rattles on either side for these. It's crazy. And that, in fact, I think those fish to some level are picking up on that because that's a lot more chatter than what I'm dropping in the water. What I'm looking for is simply to build the profile of this fly without, again, adding a whole bunch of thick material. I've got a hollowed out glass bead with a little bit of knock in there. Here's one thing I do think about the rattle. Do I think it draws them in from 2 yards away? No. However, everybody's had that fish in and around that fly in those last 4 or 5 strips, and they'll do that tap around to kind of finish that predation or that last minute, come to on the fly. If that fish is within, a yard or so or a few feet of that bug and you tap that thing right, do you think he's going to hear that little click like it's a broken back of a fish? Why not? It's no different than, hear a lot of guys, oh, I don't like putting eyes on my flies. And I go, well, okay, that's up to you. My argument is this on this. At a distance, do I think the eyes matter? Absolutely not. But when a fish comes in, as you know, none of these fish can eat a fish backwards. It'll kill them. The fins will open up. They'll choke themselves. You'll see them on the side of the river dead as a doornail because they tried to swallow a fish backwards. So if fish have to eat all of their bait fish or medium fish head first, the easier you show that fish's proximity to the head, the easier it is for that fish to get the angle to grab that head. So if putting a couple of sticky eyes on the side of a head gives them that kind of the dot on the target, so to speak, so be it. Sold American on my end. So
there's just to pipe in here, I was recently listening to a podcast and it talked about how like little reef fish get laid, like they hatch on the reef and they float into the open ocean. They were always trying to figure out how the fish made it back to the reef. And it turns out that they listen and they can hear like the cracking and the popping noises of shrimp and stuff on the reef for like several miles away, and that's how they get back to the reef. And then
those lateral lines and stuff, they're picking up stuff that we are only. I mean, to be honest, I don't really know if the community's fully aware of what that lateral line picks up. I mean, we all have our guesses, and there's this study here and that study there, but there's a lot of sensory going on. And what tells us this is if you've ever gone and fished absolute chocolate water, I'm not talking like heavily stained. I'm talking like you gotta watch for trees coming down because it's just flowing harshies. And you will go out and throw giant black streamers. And how the hell can they find those things if you can't see your fly 6 inches below the surface yet go down and still catch a half a dozen fish? Because not because they could see it, but because they could feel it. And half of the takes that you get in muddy water are right above the fish versus kind of broadsiding or bringing it by a fish, because they're always using what little light they have on those muddy conditions to kind of look up and find some silhouette, which is why black or claret, depending on how you're looking at it, have the strongest silhouette in any watercolor. It's just that's the most powerful color of I mean, it's not I thought it was black when I was a kid, but I reread that claret underwater, which is to say a little bit of red in the black, actually stands out more than black itself, which kind of blew my mind. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, what was the question there? I lost that one.
So the comment was that I actually believe fish hear quite well, and that the podcast was about how ocean noises are disrupting fish from finding reefs, juvenile fish from finding reefs, and it just got me thinking like everyone assumes fish can't hear, but turns out that they actually usually have very, very good hearing.
Yeah, they are not as sonically challenged as we'd like to think. And so here's a good story that baselines that one. So I'm fishing below Mayo Dam. Let's say this is 15 years ago. Water's heavily stained. I bring a good bull to the side of the boat, fishing front. I threw a straight across. By the time he came in, he was coming in on the oarman's starboard oarlock. And the fish was maybe 15 feet away from the oarlock and turned away as my bug came to the front of the boat. And the fish was facing the other direction, like it was facing where it had come from. And my bug is well out of its point of view at that point. And I remember that was like one of the first years we were throwing the bigger drunks over there. And those had the little bit larger rattles in them because we were throwing like the 2-aught and the 3-aught. And I simply gave that bug 2 little taps with the rod, all but giving up on the possibility of catching that fly. I did those 2 taps. That fish wasn't looking anywhere in my direction. He turned around, came 50 feet across the bow of the boat, off the oarman, and grabbed the fly. There's no way he saw it do that. There's no way. He felt that. He heard it, the click, whatever you want to call it. At 50 feet away, that fish was aware of that movement and made an about face and killed that thing right off the bow of the boat, but not after going by the oarsman again. So, yeah, I do believe that they pick up on stuff. I also believe that the rattle that I was using in that triple, by the way, was a bigger rattle than I'm using in this tiny one here, which is for more creek or medium river stuff. That reminds me, Maro, you said you wanted to get into some chatter about the smaller water.
Yeah, so the water, the kind of the local water for our club is the Grand that you're very familiar with, and the Credit is the other one, which is kind of, it's a higher gradient river, and it's quite a bit smaller than the Grand, maybe half the size. I think in terms of CFS, it's probably in the like 30 to 70, depending on conditions. So it's cold water and more bouldery, not so much wood, although there are some log jams, obviously, but they relate more to the rocks, I think, than like on the PM where they seem to relate a lot more to the wood, is because you have so much. But maybe you could talk about and our season goes like beginning of May to end of September.
I can hear you.
Maybe something around conditions, like different colors for different conditions in the smaller water, like
sure.
May and like end of September.
Yeah. So I would say obviously in May, when the water's really cold, if you guys are still fighting a little bit of cold water, I really like those chartreuse whites. I don't know what that appeal is for that, but that's something I've noticed on the Pier Marquette, that the chartreuse and white, for some reason, whenever there's any amount of cold in the water, it just plays. And don't ask me why. That's like asking me why they eat a Sable skunk as good as they do. I don't understand it. I just fish it. Chartreuse against the backlit of the snow, maybe. Maybe it's against the sky that time of year, maybe the cold water. There's a different, predator stance in their mindset. It doesn't look like a bait fish. I don't know too many chartreuse smolts swimming around. At the same time, it still goes down like a Scooby snack. So it's something to consider for your thing. White is always a good early season, depending on if you have migratory fish or not. This kind of will dictate. Black is always, if you guys are deep into the cool weather, or even when the fish get a little bit more lethargic, black is tough to stay off, especially in the mornings. Black is always huge at night too. Black is a strong silhouette on the surface or just subsurface.
Right.
I'm not a big fan of orange, but I don't have a lot of affinity for fishing crawdads. I have some orange that I fish in some of my what we call the fire tiger patterns. And that's like a chartreuse and an orange, and that ends up glowing almost like a yellow. Before I keep going here, does everybody kind of up to speed with what I've done here? Everybody who's been watching that? So I've got like this one collar of a bunny. It's like 1.5 by the time the smoke clears. I've got my two flanks to build, my two sides of the butter knife on the front here, which I'll clean up before. That's our third and last stage of the Flashaboo on top. This after I took that polar chenille and I palmered all the way around that rattle, and then one extra in front of the rattle just to kind of cup off that material.
Maybe can you comment on where you stop the bunny to start the deer?
So that obviously will vary based upon how many pencils that I would use up here. You guys can see that as much material as I built back here, all I'm trying to do is leave just enough so that I can build the kind of the locomotion for the whole fly here, which is simply a door stopper deer wedge, which is allowed to cup and drag the water. Also, notice I go with a down eye, not a straight eye here. I know a few people in the industry commercially that are tying these things with straight eyes, and it's absurd. The idea of it is to draw that wedge down, not to skitter it across the water like it's some kind of, steelhead skating fly,
Yeah.
I mean, which isn't to say there isn't plenty of good uses for a straight eye hook. I play ton of stoneflies on the same stuff. But for what we're using it for, we want to engage that wedge as soon as possible, because that's really all the locomotion of this pattern here. So you were asking before, Maro, see, I'm kind of using the knuckle of that bunny in front of it. And the one fellow was asking me about the material, the bulk, right?
Yeah.
And half the reason I use the bunny on the leather is that I want this shoulder. And I'm about to show you why with the deer.
Yeah.
Because the deer, when I come up along this in the front, I'm building a straight wall here that cuts off on like a hide. So when I take that collar and give it a snudge, I mean, that thing pops. It doesn't just flare over. I mean, it pops. And that's part of that low material, high signature that I'm looking to kind of encourage this bug to kind of leave. I don't want to leave a big, massive amount of mass signature. I simply just want the profile of what a fish would feel like coming through that water when it goes by a fish in any different CFS. So we were talking, I think a little today, Maro, about the speeds and stuff, you know, and how sometimes when the water's clear, we speed up, and when it's dirty, we can slow it down. So up to this point, folks, you can kind of see we've got the whole body built. We've got the tail puller. There's going to be a lot of movement here. And here's what I'll do is I'll tie this down really quick, and I'll whip it just so we can talk really quick about what I've done here and why the final step plays. So here's that butter knife. You can kind of see that cupping of the flank on the top of it. You've got that flank that the flash that I usually leave peeking out of the Mallard flank just so it peaks. And the same here. When I come over with that second ball of thing, I'll come into about the halfway point of, the halfway point of the flank. Sorry, let me get that. I'm going to look at the computer and not the fly. So if I'm back here, you guys can kind of see that when I cut this off, that flash is kind of even. So you don't want to get it so long that it starts getting tangled in there. And then this one cuts off just in front of that. So it's like stage flash. Again, I don't want this flash terribly thick underneath. You guys can kind of see that underneath this fly, there's almost no flash, right? Kind of like a Rapella has no flash on the top and all the flash on the bottom. We do the exact same, but the opposite here because I'm going to tip this. When this bug is tipping and yawing as I dig in and to the left, it'll peekaboo this flash to the fish and not to us. Does this make sense? We always have the flash. It gives us a good visual on the bug sometimes. But when I tip this thing with that wedge going, those fish get the peekaboo of the flash. And again, that's that indication of injury. That kind of, you know, you're picking that fight. You're setting off that predator. Let me get this back in. We'll build ahead. So get that nice and snug for this one.
And you
We're
did
gonna come back.
You did two colors of bunny at the front.
Yes, I like that mold. I like that molted kind of blend up there. You guys can see I went with the tan, the yellow, the olive. I got a little copper, all that butterscotch underbelly. I mean, I'm trying to keep the idea of this. And if I am keeping the idea of this, we all know that that brown trout's back is generally kind of that tan, orange, brownish into the green head, right? You guys can always notice that a brown trout's head, as a rule, tends to darken an olive as it goes into the forward. So let me get tied back up on here. So for this pattern, because we're tying a micro, unlike a mini or a standard, we were just talking about all the different pencil sizes and whatnot for this evolution. Let me grab my razor rhyme up here. Get all my guns in.
We should maybe before you get into the pencils, maybe let's talk about the hook sizes for the different.
Yeah. Very good. So up on the front here, the back here is a size 8, and that's a B10S Gamakatsu. Up on the front is a Montana fly, and that's a 4X long. I'm not sure the number off that offhand. It's a 4X long, 2X strong down eye, and that's a size 6. And again, this would be considered our micro, and we do it in nano for pretty much specifically just the cricks. You don't want to really get into the nanos for any big water flows, because if you do, then what happens is that smaller wedge will twist as soon as it, I mean, by the time the smoke clears, when you fish this correctly, it's digging and it's chucking and jiving, just like a Rapella does. Versus the same thing is if you over reel a Rapella, what it does is starts to spin, right? This is no different. This is, I mean, by the time the smoke clears, you're essentially tying a crankbait here. And that's the action that you're looking for, is that erratic action without throwing any weight. It's terribly comfortable throwing drunks because they don't weigh a thing. Get your hair scissors out here. And we're going to take a full pencil of deer. Oh, did I mention also, Maro, that that wire in the middle is a 30-pound. And
He
like,
did, yeah.
okay, and then like if we were to get into some of those big triples like the 5/0 and stuff, we get into like 65-pound just to keep the tension of that heavier hook in the back at that point, right?
So let me make a comment here on the triple, Tommy. Um,
Uh-huh.
there's a guy out there that has a video that
Hmm.
is completely incorrect. And he's tying this fly, and it's the triple, but he ties it with 3 shanks. So 3
Yeah,
hooks.
he's unaware is what he is all.
No, exactly. And I'm just warning people that if they go to some video or try to find a video online, make sure you're watching Tommy's video. There isn't a correct,
I
from what I can
so I
tell.
love the game changer tails, the way they slither. And we've actually tried to implement some of those game changers, especially any place where the water slows. The problem in Western Michigan is everywhere where we're fishing trout, for the very most part, we're fishing them in some kind of flow, and that tends to straighten out the tail. It doesn't let it do that really cool, like when you're fishing it in slow water for smallies or muskie and pike.
Right.
It's hard to make the game changers work. So I think that's kind of the biggest reason I went with this kind of this more wide glide crankbait versus kind of that game changer. Not that a game changer isn't cool as hell. I think they are. I know
Yeah.
Blaine well. It's a very cool fly.
Yeah.
I just in anytime there's current, we've had a problem keeping the tails from just straightening out. You know what I mean? And we've got our hair, got a big stacker. I got this giant. It's called the whitetail. Is that thing showing up, or did I do that?
No, I don't see it.
Oh, hold on.
You got to come. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Dano's doing cool stuff. So this is a big whitetail. These things are massive. I found this at a show. And there we go. But you don't really need to on this size fly. On other size flies, you could. That's a better step. Okay, and what I do here, guys, typically I'll cover up about 3/4 of that bunny. See where I bring those guards? Right up to about here, I'll grab the back, make sure that's real snug to that wall that we were just talking about. 2 pulls, and I'll bring that down way back here. I'm pulling down that fly. Then I'll add in 3rd, 4, 5, 6, just to lock that thing down. Give that thumb action in there. Make sure your collar's getting the good spread. And then I do recommend these packers. These things are really good when you're working a lot of deer in a short spot. Almost there, guys. You guys can see with my thumb here, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of maneuvering this collar in such a way that I can see it on the bottom underside and on the starboard side going up under that lip to make sure I've got a good coverage. And then I've got my nice big lion hide here. Take that one more push back just to maximize as much of this hook eye, because I always ask Morrow, I use the whole bloody hook. You can see I'm just pulling on this deer now. As I've got it locked down, I'll give it one more snug pulling on that deer. I want all of that collar, pinch, and I've got all that material now in front of that thread. See that? Now I've still got enough. I'm still going to get 2 more pencils of deer, albeit smaller pencils, because this is a micro. I'm going to get into a little bit of an olive mixture here. And just going to clean that up a little bit. No need to stack this one, guys. I'm going to take and I'm really going to nurse that thing back there. Give that a push and a tug. When I come back, I'm pulling down that hook back in there. I want that deer right up on that brown. There goes that thumb again, just getting that maximum coverage.
I'm amazed at how little room you leave for the head. I gotta tell you.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, I've tied a bunch of these, and I always find that if I don't leave enough room for the head, I'm in trouble. You seem to be able to get a lot of deer hair into a
Man, you
smaller
should see me
area.
try and do my taxes, Morrow. I mean, I'm terrible. I can't do any of that shit. But fly tying and brown trout, I've got somewhat figured now. But computers, taxes, I mean, my wife's made it so easy for me to just regress into my 25-year-old self the last half a dozen years. She doesn't really need me to grow up. She's already an adult. We only need one in the family.
Well done.
So we're going to take yet again. We're going for one more. And I know that doesn't seem like a lot of room up there, but when you get that wedge right up on that eye, it walks better, doesn't it? Because you get that nice neutrality right out of its head. Always the trickiest one of them all. I will tell you too, folks, these are often easier to tie in larger sizes. When you start tying them, don't start with these little ones. You'll pull your hair out. So literally,
Literally.
we're gonna take and we're gonna give that a really good snug because we're using all of that area there. We're gonna grab that deer. You can see, Morrow, not only am I making sure it's back, but I'm pulling it back, right?
Yeah.
Snugging that thread, pulling it back, snugging that thread, pulling it back. Just getting enough room so I can slip in that one right there. Just that one little secure. That's enough. Now I'm gonna give this one more push and I'm gonna whip it. Give that a good spin. Like I said, you can always be a little bit more manhandling with your GSB if you spin it up and don't let it floss apart. You know what I mean? You can see what I'm doing here with my fingers. I'm kind of using that just to get in there for that lock in. Oh, missed it. Again, the bigger ones have a bigger eye and the deer is still the same length. So I'm going to get one secure up in there just to be sure. There's one. And there's two. Give that a nice snug in. There we go. Everybody with me here to this point?
Mm-hmm. So are you
Again,
intentionally putting less on the bottom than on the top? Or is that just kind of right?
I'm essentially, I mean, the first one you could almost argue is kind of spun like an elk hair caddis,
Sure.
where you're trying to keep basically the top 2/3 of the hemisphere completely wrapped like down into its side and leaving that bottom third kind of open.
Yeah.
You don't need the material under that chin for two reasons. One, it's just it's bulky and you're not using it where you want it, which is to float the head. But number two, if you have any float under the chin, this bug will have a tendency to not right itself. So all these actions I want this thing to perform post strip when I give it those actions, I also want it to recover perfectly. I want it to still have a hemisphere of up and down. That head and back is to the belly. I don't want it to just roll over like a leech, do I? So
Right.
if I have all of that deer up in the top and not on the bottom, then that deer has a tendency to right itself level and that whole swag happens behind it. Is everybody with me on that?
Maybe since the whole hook question was brought up, maybe you can talk about front hook versus back hook. Some of your thoughts there.
Say that one more time. The what kind of hook?
The front hook versus back hook, because we can only keep one hook, right? So like, do you keep the front or do you keep the back hook?
So, and I would say this, for all you guys that are fishing in that fall or later season, stay with the back hooks because that's that fall grur season. Whenever you're fishing that shark attack or feeding season, I would stay with the forward hook because it's number one, stronger. Number two, again, most trout want to eat the head of a fly so they don't kill themselves. So the forward hook is the most likely contact point.
Right.
In theory. So,
But
yeah.
you are seeing times like, I mean, let's say like guys like Gallup, they basically say you always keep the front hook, but I mean I've had many times where they're nipping at the back end. So you feel like there are times when the nipping at the back end should have a back hook, not the front hook.
If you guys are fishing that kind of season where you have, because you got to remember that the point of contact, there is a big difference between a fending bite and a feeding bite. A feeding bite is a full shark attack where they try and turn over and grab the head of the fly as they get it. so they can scoop it right down, take it head first, which you could argue is the whole reason why most trout commit suicide on the downstream progression of the fly. If you guys have ever noticed that in faster water, when the fly's coming down, the fish have a tendency to really shark it without as much critique because the fish is offering that head up in its retreat downstream. It's like running right at the fish. All the fish has to do is, raise its pec fins and collide into the head of that fly. In the same respect, when you have a fish following the fly or coming up behind it, more so in the fall series, they're going to be nipping at that tail, which is where you could argue that rear hook.
Thanks.
So, I mean, and to say that I, want to use the rear, but like even on those Beetlejuices, we set that hook in the back with a shank in the front on those Beetlejuices that I was showing. It wasn't tandem hook. It was single hook. And we leave it in the back because we know at night that the fish have a tendency to come up and then behind the fly because we're fishing in the top of the column. Unlike if we're fishing a streamer where we might be just showing them that broadside position or coming right down on them with that downstream persuasion cast where you're either using bow tension or a direct upstream cast that is stripped right to your person, whichever. But as soon as you get into the swim fly, you realize that the shock of the line transmit a far. So think of it like this. A rod tip bends if I lift it. Because I lifted up the fly, there's a bend, and that bend in the rod is a shock absorber. When you're fishing a swim fly, you're trying to transmit shock. You're not trying to suck it up. So when you're fishing a lead fly, simply lifting the fly up and then having it fall is the baseline for the entire muse of different action that it has in the parachuting of its fall only. We can agree on that. If you put lead in the front of it, it's going to fall. It doesn't matter what kind of training material it does. It can slow that progression of fall. It can speed it up. But unless you keel weight a hook with like wrapping lead around the keel of the hook instead up on the front, you're not really trying to get any other action out of that fly outside of an up and down leech-like maneuvering. When I shock a line, that is to say that there is no bend of rod when I strip a line directly to that water's entry, which is to say that rod tip to the water, that gap of line has zero, and I do mean zero rod bend per strip, so that that line shocks when I pop it. When I shock that line, that shock is transmitted to the wedge. The wedge does everything I need it to and more that I can't get a lead fly to do. Does that make sense? Sorry about that. And again, the lift wiggle, which is not to say it's anything like what, a lift and pop like a gallop. A lift and wiggle that I'm referring to that Morrow could probably discern to you over a little bit more time is you actually, if you're fishing a very shallow area or you're trying to keep your sink tip from ditching out in the wood or the bottom, but you still want that swim fly, in a piece of water, you couldn't even fish with lead because it would ditch in the moment you took your eye off of it. So what I would do is, because a wedge, and anybody that fishes a drunk for any amount of time will tell you that the moment you go to pull the drunk from the water and the drunk is still 2 or 3 inches under the water, that bug velcros to the water. It's anchored because that wedge doesn't want you to let it pull it from the water. You use the same problem that you're having with the cast in the presentation. As I send it over there, I let that sink tip achieve just a few inches of water, but because I'm lifting, the wedge is digging through that transmit. So as I'm shaking the line side to side in that lift progression, that bug is getting umpteen different shots of shock to it from the shocking of that line side to side. So again, even though I'm using the rod, I'm not using the rod directly to the fly head so much as I'm using it to promote that sink tip from sinking, all the while adding shock in the transmission. I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot out, and I don't even know if I'm hearing what I'm saying anymore.
So,
Oh,
so
good.
floating lines usually?
You could argue floating line's better for if I fish lead flies today, I would fish a long leader and a floating line before I would fish a sink tip, because the lead in the fly is enough to have that low diameter leader penetrate that 3 to 4 feet that most of us are looking for. So sink tips and lead are I don't want to say they cancel each other out, but I'm not necessarily sure it's necessary. Whenever you're using a swim fly, a sink tip is generally necessary unless you're using a floating line and a long leader on a spey rod, in which case you're letting the leader and the wedge determine your depth, not the line itself. Does this make sense?
Yeah, and so for the sink tip, are you going for like the 7 inches per second or how quick?
I'm not so, and that's another great question. You know, there's a big myth on this whole I need to get deeper, faster, stronger, harder. That's so male of us all. The idea of a swim fly is neutrality. When a fish is dying, it doesn't hit the bottom. It just starts jolting around in weird, obscure ways in the mid column most of the time. So neutrality is what I want. I want a tight 5 sinking line most of the time when I'm fishing this fly. Now, if I'm on the White in Arkansas and the water's blown out and I need depth immediate, then I can start getting into some more aggressive sink tips where I achieve all the depth with the sink tip while the fly is sometimes still floating near the surface. But if I let that sink tip achieve 7 feet by allowing slack on the impact and that time for that sink tip to achieve that 4 to 5 feet, as soon as I lift that rod, where does the bug go? It goes right down to that 5-6 feet of water where the sink tip is, doesn't it? So that's just the big tip to remember on all this stuff. Let the fly be fished by the line, not you directly to the fly. That's a leaded present. And I would argue that a lot of people that start with drunks, they end up fishing them kind of wrong. It's not until you're fishing them right do you see the potential of the bug. And I will tell you, it'll consume you. I mean, it gets really boring watching the other flies after you've learned how to make this one walk the dog.
Well, I will. So let
And
me.
don't think for 1 second too, folks, that I had all this faith and confidence in this bug when I first came out with it. It came to me one night when I was going to sleep after 2 Rapella fishermen had given me a report that they kicked my ass yet again after I thought I had a pretty good day. And I said, what is that big pen with a yellow eye got that we don't have in this chicken? And all it is it's a ink pen with a yellow eye, and it kind of tips and it yaws. It tips and it yaws, and it has a little flash on either side of that tip and yaw. And that's what we tried to mimic here. That's the end result. So I'm sorry, Mara, I cut you off.
No, I was gonna say. I think a couple of things. One is until you see what the bug can do. I think Tommy's exactly right. Like it's you will have trouble fishing it until you see someone fish it properly. So
And
you should
it
you
is.
should
I
book.
promise.
Yeah, you should book Tommy for a day and go fish it.
Daniel's telling me to start the cut while I do this. Let's talk about leaders as we go. If I'm fishing like a big tailwater and my cast is upwards of, let's say that cast is upward of 80, 90 feet. You know what I mean? We're on a big tailwater, White River, Muskegon, something really wide, something where you can really spread your wings. A short leader in that forum is very, very incorrect unless and only unless I'm using lead. Because with lead, leaders don't matter because we're trying to contact that head direct with that fly rod. We're not trying to add a shock in the line so much as we're trying to lift that bug up so it can resync in a unique, cool kind of pulsating, undulating, falling still just that way. Okay, here comes a big one. Watch how much I lose on this bottom. I mean, it's gone. Who wants it? We don't want it. We're going to come right up to that bunny up there. I don't need to see any of that material down there whatsoever. And I want a nice little primer here. You guys can kind of see that there's almost nothing there. And then right here, I'm going to come on the sides, kind of using that razor blade the way we like. These regals are kind of nice because you can just kind of get that basic overview of side to front, etc. This is kind of the rough cut. You kind of get it in your hand so you can really peel it apart. But just with those few maneuvers, you guys can kind of see the wedge taking place there. Now, I'm going to kind of clean this up in my hand here really quick, and then I'll show you some finished product here before we add all the dressing and whatnot. Almost there. And it's okay to see your thread down there, guys. It really is. On the
Everybody
top,
likes rubber legs. Would that mess up the swim on this guy if you threw in some rubber
I'm
legs?
glad you asked that. As a matter of fact, it would. Something I love using on the Beetlejuice, though, because I fish it completely different. But you're not wrong. Rubber legs would promote for more anchor in the current, wouldn't it? Yeah,
Sure.
I'm not looking for, again, I believe that a streamer take is kind of sold 2 or 3 yards away. And rubber legs, as cool as they are in close, I don't know if they're bringing them in from 2 yards away. You know what I mean? So, again, if I'm fishing a night fly where I assume a fish is going to come up behind that pattern and study it before it smokes it, now I could talk about that, especially when I'm doing that kind of loose drift back to the fish. If I believe he's on it or considering it, I can always drop that back a little bit. Almost there, guys. Just making this as pretty as I can in short order. I know. Oh, do I got time? Almost there. I really like that thing flat because I want that water cupped. Unlike a Madonna or a Cougar or a Muddler head, I don't want this water just to push off and get a float recovery. I'm looking for dig. I want walk. I want yaw. I want tipping hemispheres. I want that injury. I want that off equilibrium. Imagine a fish that has a ball of air in its gut that it cannot get rid of. And it's trying to keep its belly under him because it knows if it doesn't keep its belly under him, what happens? It dies. Can't swim if it's doing all the wrong things right. Almost there. I want a nice shaved head to show you that wedge. There we
So
go.
on the
Okay.
top of the wedge, you want it really flat, like not bullet shaped, so that the water like
Mhm.
hits the collar
I
easier.
want it to, yeah, I don't want to dimple it. I tried doing that and it had the exact effect I thought it would, but to a level that I didn't need it. When I cupped it, when I would actually put a dimple inside that top, what would happen, it was over grab the water. It would start to spin the fly because it was grabbing too much water. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So if I simply just leveled it out, and let me see if I can see this. Can you guys see that? Here, let me see if
Yep.
I can put it right up there. You guys can kind of see it's got that wedge now. Almost nothing on the bottom there, right?
Just
And now you've
back
got,
up a little bit just for the focus.
sorry,
Back up a little bit, a little closer to you.
how's, how's,
Hey, yeah, there you go. There you go.
how's that? How's
Perfect.
that?
That's perfect.
So you can kind of see that wedge, and I've kind of kept that theme of the olive head transitioning into that golden tan back with the whitened underbelly. We're trying to keep that fish in mind here, okay? I'm just going to clean this up just a hair more just because this is going to Montana fly. And let's see here. There we go. There we go. And that thing is ready for some blue. And I don't like anything but guards in that collar. So if you go around and you haven't gotten all of those back ends of your deer, just kind of pluck out the 2 or 3 that are still left. But you can see that collars. Remember, we were talking, somebody had asked the question, why use the bunny? You can see that collar and how erect that is coming off of that wall of bunny.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, there's almost nothing to this bug back here. See me pinching this together? There's nothing here. The entire signature of that pattern is right here. That stiff little guard and that little bulk of bunny. That's all the mass that this bug has. The rest of it is just air. It's just so light. So let's get some basic little glue on eyes here. Okay, I'm gonna put in just a couple of teardrops of glue on the sides here, guys. And I do mean small for these smaller eyes that we're using. So we're gonna grab some of that Solaris here. And all we're using this for, the biggest reason we use the Solaris here, folks, is to, oh, sorry. It's hard to do this in the vise. Well, I'll try. Yeah, I'll try. So what we're going to do here is Dana wants this thing back in the vise, so he's going to get it back in the vise. So what we're going to do here now is we're going to take a little craft brush here. We're going to get off our old glue so it spreads. Take our Solaras here. There we go. And goop. So we got a semi-good stain of goop there. And what I'll do is I'll usually just take a pretty good hunk. I'll tap one side here. Make sure I don't take off my freshly glued eye. And I'll tap the other side. You're trying to, again, it's always good to give this a little bit of time for that super glue to set, but we don't have it, so we're on it. And then I'll take the rest of that and I'll flip it over. And I'll just make sure that all of that underside has got a little bit. And all I'm trying to do is basically give this deer some durability. And, you know, that's really the only reason we use it. You spend the time tying a fly like this, and, you know you're going to have to go dig it out of the trees a couple of times. But as long as you're going to spend the time making a fly and engineering a fly to move like this, it becomes not a nymph. It's not a dry fly. It's not even a hopper. It's something that you don't leave behind. If you hang it up on a tree, Mara will tell you there's a mild art to getting stuff out of wood. And if you get good at it, it's rare to lose a bug. It really is. And the more you kind of practice getting out of stuff, the easier you get. There's all kinds of little tricks like rolling off, I'm sure you've seen. Slack, keeping the direction of which way the hook went in when you did it. That's all we're going to do here for that thing. We're going to take our little poker here. Make sure I didn't fluster that eye up with any funky. And then I'm going to take my UV lantern, one usually about 15 seconds per side. And presto. Drunk, disorderly, deceiver. That's where triple D, by the way, comes from. It's 3 Ds, drunk, disorderly, deceiver. And it would be just a drunk and disorderly if it didn't have the tail. The tail is what makes it the deceiver there, the little, whatever. But, I mean, you pick it up by its thing, it even kind of looks like a fish. Here, let me hold it back here. And again, Mara will tell you that there's almost no weight with these bugs. So they're very, very easy to throw, heavily actioned. And tie them durable. Like, use your GSB the way it's supposed to. Don't just wrap it around like it's denier. It's denier it's GSB. So give it a snug. Bite that thread into your material so they're less likely to move. I'm not a big fan of gluing everything. I see this new trend in fly fishing on and I can kind of see where they're using it on those terrestrials in the foam where that thread wants to open up and bust. But, on a lot of this stuff, I don't think we should be using that stuff. I think it adds weight. And if you're using your thread correctly, I think it's just overkill.